Great. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people. Even though Creative Mornings is a sort of decentralized entity taking place in numerous territories around the globe, here in Victoria, we do recognize the people that are now called the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich nations. And we thank them for being stewards of this land. And today's topic on archives, I think, will actually generate an interesting discussion around how memory is preserved and what part of languages stick around and what parts systems oppress and various categories like that. So I think it's a great idea to always think about where you're logging in from, the place that you are right now, and who was there before and who will be here later. So with that, my name is Kagan McFadden, and I'm the Executive Director of the Victoria Arts Council, and I'm very happy to see you all today. This is one of our more popular Creative Mornings, so I think we should just get it going, and I'll pass it over to Leah McInnes.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Kagan. As I mentioned, I have some slides to thank our sponsors. So welcome everyone to Creative Mornings. Just a second here as it's, okay, thank you. Welcome to Creative Mornings. As Kagan mentioned, my name is Leah McInnes. I work at the Victoria Arts Council as the Outreach Coordinator, and I also am a co-lead of the Victoria chapter of Creative Mornings. This month, our theme is liminal. When we find ourselves in an in-between place, we might call our location liminal. Liminal space is found at the threshold between leaving an old life and starting a new one, when we have shed a tired identity, but not yet donned a fresh one. Liminality is a state of becoming. Our Sophia chapter chose this month's exploration of liminal, and Sevda Semar illustrated the theme. Thank you to MailChimp, Creative Mornings' official global partner for marketing. We're so proud of our friends at MailChimp. 1 year ago, they launched MailChimp & Co. Today, MailChimp & Co. is a global network, just like Creative Mornings. Their 20,719 members hail from more than 150 countries. If you're a freelancer or agency helping small businesses succeed with their email and marketing strategy, check out MailChimp & Co. to learn skills, build your reputation, and get tools to help you manage your clients. It's free and easy to get started. Thank you to Skillshare, our global partner for online learning. Skillshare is an online learning community helping millions take the next step on their creative journey. Quitting a full-time gig for freelance work shouldn't hinge on a single milestone. In Skillshare's new series, The Leap, self-taught photographer Andrew Kung shares what to consider before he took the plunge into freelance work. And you can check out his videos on the Skillshare's YouTube channel. Thank you to the City of Victoria for their ongoing support of Creative Mornings. And thank you to HCMA. HCMA is an architecture firm that designs buildings, brands, and shared experiences that connect people. So Kagan and I, we are part of the Victoria Arts Council, and I just wanted to let you know that this is the last weekend to view our current exhibition titled Open Archives, Archives Ajar. In this exhibition, we're displaying over 50 years of ephemera, documents, files, folders, and it's on display. And after this weekend, it's going to be transferred to the special collections at the University of Victoria. So this exhibition, this talk today, they dovetail together. So please join me in welcoming Laura Wilson and Heather Dean. Heather Dean is an Associate Director of Special Collections at the University of Victoria Libraries, where she is responsible for managing rare print materials and private archives. Prior to joining the University of Victoria Libraries, she was an archivist with the Benecke Rare Book, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, Benecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. She holds a Master of Arts in English Literature from the University of Victoria and a Master of Archival Studies and Master in Library and Information Studies from the University of British Columbia. She is the incoming chair of the section on Archives of Literature and Art with the International Council on Archives. And our second speaker today, Laura Wilson, is the Director of Special Collections and University Archivist at the University of Victoria, British Columbia. She has held various appointments in the University of Victoria Library since 2001. Laura holds a Master of Arts in Art History and Visual Studies from the University of Victoria and a Master of Archival Studies from the University of British Columbia. She has twice served as President of the Archives Association of British Columbia, is past chairperson of the Canadian Council of Archives, and is presently serving on the boards of the Friends of BC Archives and the National Archives Appraisal Board. So I'm going to pass it over now. Please join me in welcoming Laura and Heather.
So as Lara mentioned, we're joining from UVic. And so on the screen here, you can see consecutive aerial photographs that show the development of UVic's campus over time. And of course, this is a reminder that UVic has not always been on these lands. So we would like to respectfully acknowledge the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territories the University of Victoria stands, and the Esquimalt, WSÁNEĆ, and Songhees peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue until this day. And as Kagan kind of hinted at, there's a lot of places where we see dynamics between settler and Indigenous communities play out. And the archives is one of those places. And so as cultural heritage professionals, Lara and I would like to acknowledge our responsibility in continuing to decolonize our practice and the institutions where we work. So as mentioned earlier, the theme for Creative Mornings this month is liminal. So we'd like to begin with discussing this theme within the context of archives. And we'll then move into introducing you to special collections and university archives at UVic, including the artist archives that are here. We'll talk a little bit about caring for archives, how we do that in the institution, but also how you can think of this at home. And then we'll just open it up for a broad conversation with you, and we're happy to answer questions as they come up. And of course, with a topic like this, we always feel like we need to start with talking about, well, what are archives? So what are archives? They are documents that are made and received by a person or an organization in the conduct of their daily life and work, and then set aside and preserved. And documents can take many forms. So this can include letters to email, preliminary sketches to CAD files, from daguerreotypes to digital photographs. So archives can also be a program that's responsible for stewarding documents, as well as the physical place where documents are held. So the word archives has three meanings. You have the stuff, you have the program and the people that are responsible for caring for the stuff, and then of course the place where the stuff is kept. So we'll be moving kind of through those different terms in our conversation today. So to be liminal is to be on a threshold. And I think Leah already mentioned that earlier. This idea of being between multiple states, of being in transition, of crossing boundaries. So archives embody this liminal space in many ways. And one of these ways within our profession is the concept of the archival threshold. And within the field, this is used to describe the point at which an archival repository takes the physical custody of records. And this phrase is a metaphor. So as the Dictionary of Archives terminology acknowledges, it's this metaphor that's based on the idea of archives actually physically passing through a doorway to an institution, that they're kind of coming into the custody of an organization. And so here you can see the doorway to the University Library at UVic, And on the right, kind of in the back, you can see this beautiful mosaic that was created by a local artist, Margaret Peterson. And it's changed somewhat, but these doors are still there. So the archival threshold then demarcates what is in and what is out, that which has been selected for long-term preservation and that which has not, that which has a voice and that which is silenced. But beyond the archival threshold, there are other in-between spaces archives inhabit. So archives are also a bridge between memory and forgetting, a way of linking the past with the present. So through archives, that which is private becomes public, and that which belonged to an individual is now shared with the collective. As archivists, we're acutely aware of the need to continually question what we collect and how we can best collaborate with communities to document our shared humanity. It is a deeply collaborative endeavor, and in the rest of our time today, we'll share some of the archives from special collections and university archives that result from this shared work, and talk about how we can work together to preserve the cultural record. So I'll pass things over to Lara.
Thank you so much, Heather. Some of the historical background now on the development of special collections and university archives. So the University of Victoria was established as a degree granting institution in 1963. However, you may not know that UVic was preceded by Victoria College and affiliated with initially McGill University in Montreal and the University of British Columbia, beginning in 1903, and the Provincial Normal School here in Victoria, which was the teacher training college. So Victoria College absorbed the Provincial Normal School, and then in 1963, we became the first university on Vancouver Island. The acquisition of rare materials, however, began in the Victoria College era, led by the initiative of Professor Roger Bishop, who was a member of the English department, and he went on to a faculty position here at the university. Special Collections was established in the late 1960s with a focus on rare books and periodicals and manuscript materials. We have an internationally recognized collection of literary archives, particularly modernist British, American, and Anglo-Irish literature. The University Archives was established in the early 1970s, and the imperative was to locate, acquire, transfer the institutional records and reports of those first few years of the university, as well as the records of Victoria College and the Normal School. And these would be records from departments, both academic and administrative, as well as faculty papers. Our acquisition activities have expanded since those early years in response to emerging fields of study, including Canadian military history, university research centers and their research outputs, Vancouver Island publishing, environmentalism and gender studies, and of course, continuing acquisition of faculty papers. In 2010, we embarked on the acquisition of artists' archives. So these are artists of historical and contemporary and historical artists who are connected to UVic and Vancouver Island in some way with established national or international reputations. Okay, so Heather, can you move to the next slide? Thanks. As you will see, we have a number of artist archives in our holdings. Some of these archives were acquired prior to our 2010 acquisition initiative. And amongst those would be the correspondence of E.J. Hughes and the extensive archives of Catherine Maltwood. Catherine Maltwood in particular, very significant overall to the university. She was an English artist and she moved to Canada with her husband, John. But her art and their art collection formed the core of UVic Legacy Galleries collections. This is formerly known as the Maltwood Gallery. And that collection now is amongst one of the largest in Canada overall. Some of you from Victoria may recognize a number of these artists: Robert Amos, Mafonwi Pavlich, Glenn Howarth, Sandra Meeks, who is a retired member of our visual arts faculty, and Avis Rasmussen, who is also an active artist in our community. But you can see quite a few artists' archives. And I'll also note that we have the records of the Victoria Limner Society, and a number of artists in that group are represented here. Heather, would you like to mention some of the correspondence found in the Herbert Reed archives?
Sure. So as Lara mentioned, there's a number of artists who are represented in the collection who maybe don't have a connection with Victoria. So in some cases, there's families that have moved to the region and they've brought their family's archives. And sometimes this includes the archives of an artist who was perhaps an ancestor and active. And then also, as Lara mentioned, we have a number of literary archives, and often there's a connection between different creatives working together. And in one case, we have the archives of Herbert Reed, who was an art historian and an anarchist and working in the UK, and was deeply connected with a number of artists active over the course of the 20th century. So we have very rich and illuminating correspondence with a number of intellectuals and artists and writers working in the 20th century. And this includes, for example, a number of letters with the British artist Barbara Hepworth, also Alexander Calder, Kadensky, a number of artists. And Herbert Reed was a very sensitive art historian who was working with artists to try and identify different art movements and styles as they were emerging. And so sometimes in these letters, you can see conversations happening about, what do we call the kind of art that you're producing? So there's some really interesting and rich correspondence that we invite you to engage with.
Thanks, Heather. Before we go to the next slide, I'll mention that artists represented in our holdings worked in a variety of media. So we have Jan and Helga Grove and Robin Hopper, who were potters. We have Glenn Howarth, who worked both in analog materials and was a pioneer in digital art in the 1980s. Carl Spreitz, who was a filmmaker, and so forth. So it's a very rich collection in terms of examples of artists working in a variety of media. Thanks, Heather.
So archives in your care, or archives in our care. So for archives, the process and not just the final product is of intense interest. So in other words, how the sausage is made, or how creative work is realized from the original research and the ideas through to a completed piece. So archives are a little bit different than, say, a gallery who is maybe interested in fine art and the final product. Archivists are interested in the process as well as the final piece. And then also in documentary art. So we have, I guess, a less narrow kind of definition of like what is art and what counts as art and what is of interest. So early plans and preliminary materials are of interest to the research community. And this might include sketches and sketchbooks, preparatory works and drafts of writings, other materials that provide contextual information, both like professional, but also personal, are useful. So CVs and artist statements, but also correspondence and diaries, photographs, honors and awards. All that material helps researchers to understand where ideas are coming from and how they're being realized. Both the analog and digital forms of items are of interest. So for example, archives acquire correspondence, and this might be in the form of letters, but it also might be in the form of email. And for organizations, annual reports and other documentation are also relevant. So what to keep? So Lara will show some more specific examples shortly, but generally archives for creatives and arts organizations include a number of items far beyond what might be found in other archives. And partly this is because of the interest in the person behind the artwork and where the inspiration is coming from. So Lara, I think what I'll do is I'll just let you kind of talk more specifically, but one thing I kind of wanted to show here was just the artist studio and this idea of like, what is in these spaces that go beyond the actual piece that they're actively working on. So what are the pieces of paper that are tucked into desks? What are the research notes that you might find? So just kind of pulling back and looking at the bigger picture of how an artist is working and what documents that process. So anything that captures the process and the context in which art is created is of interest to scholars from a variety of disciplines.
Thanks, Heather. Heather mentioned a number of the types of materials found in artists' archives, and we thought it would be useful to have a slide and have this up for a few moments for you to see and think about, and I will pull out a few of these examples. So we have this list, sort of, we maintain this list as a sort of a note, and we often, in our discussions with artists and who are potentially interested in donating with us, we're able to provide these examples because oftentimes the people that we're talking with need a little bit of guidance because in their life they've been very focused on the end work and appreciate guidance from us as to what we believe researchers may have an interest in. So these materials provide context to the artist's life and career and relationships, you know, across those elements of their lives. So as Heather mentioned, sketches and preparatory works, these works of art on paper. I'd like to point out scrapbooks that can be particularly rich sources of information about the artists, about their interests, how they wish to document their lives and ideas. So scrapbooks contain clippings, they can contain photographs, notes, often memorabilia, and these scrapbooks may span their entire lives. It just depends on the self-awareness and self-documentary activities. Correspondence, again, Heather mentioned the significance of correspondence, personal and professional, letters to other artists. I'll mention in our holdings, the Jack Wise Archives has a significant amount of letters with other artists here in British Columbia and on the West Coast of North America. Relationships with galleries and art dealers and curators. Not surprisingly, artists often also write, and so there are draft manuscripts, essays for catalogs, manifestos, and other creative works. Audiovisual material and photographs take up various spaces in artists' archives. Mafonwi Pavlich, who is on the list of artists whose archives we have, she documented her works quite extensively in photographs and their various stages. And I'll also mention favorite tools and inspirational objects. They may be paint brushes, we may have examples of, there may be examples of pigments, Jack Wise painted in very fine mandala works, and we have his magnifying eyeglasses. On the page here, I have examples of just two types of material from, on the left, Margaret Peterson's archives, and on the right, Jack Wise. So this is a clipping of Margaret Peterson from the Berkeley University Gazette. So, Margaret had preserved this clipping. Margaret was a teacher at University of California at Berkeley. And this photograph was taken by the famous American photographer, Imogene Cunningham. And on the right, this is an example of silkscreen attempts by Jack Wise, which he kept in a notebook. So again, this is a rich source of material for various research and teaching uses. Thanks, Heather.
Okay, so how to keep your archives. So ideally materials are stored when it's paper or physical materials. Ideally, they're stored in a dry environment, which is even more important now when we consider the flooding that's happening locally. So a dry environment that doesn't have extreme fluctuations in temperature and humidity, and in a space free of dirt and pests. So not in the basements and the attics that you see in the architectural rendering here by the local architect Samuel McClure. So you have the basement on the left and the attic on the right displayed. And those are, of course, where our archives are often located. So we're on the lower level of the library. But we've done a lot here to control the temperature and the humidity and to have a clean and safe space for material. So this is something to keep in mind. I know that it can be a burden to have stuff and to figure out where to put it, but just being mindful of keeping things off the floor if they're in the basement, or being careful of having material inside boxes that can protect them from any potential leaks or anything that might come up in your residence. It's helpful with digital files if they're stored in more than one location. So it's that concept of locks, which is lots of copies keep stuff safe. So if you think about, you have stuff on your computer at home, but if there's any problem with your computer, you want to have copies of that material in another location. So having more than one copy. And of course, that introduces up the issue of your file naming and keeping track of the different versions that you have. So as we're probably all painfully aware, digital files do require more intervention to ensure that they are accessible, even in the short to medium term. And Lara and I are happy to provide a few resources with more information about how to care for your digital archives. Paper is a little bit easier in that you can often tuck it away for a number of years and then come back to it. And usually you can be lucky and it's still in okay condition. But with our digital files, it's a bit different and it does require more active work. So talking to archives and libraries. So we welcome hearing from artists and others interested in transferring their archives to UVic or to another cultural heritage institution. We find that cultural heritage professionals are often very excited to hear from people. Often we're in small organizations and we're stretched pretty thin. And so while we do try and be proactive and reach out to those working in the community, we also really welcome hearing from you. So please don't wait for us to contact you. Be bold and be brave and reach out to us. So we do encourage you to be proactive, to reach out about your archives. Generally, we try not to compete with other archives. So we like to work with other archivists to find a good home for materials. So it may be that you start a conversation with one institution and then you may be put into conversation with another organization. So you can start with your local archives and they can be the ones that can work with you to find a good fit for, to find a good home for your material. And there are a few different options available. So just to be aware that in Canada, often archives are donated. In Canada, you can receive a tax receipt if you donate your archives. In other countries, that's not necessarily the case. On occasion, you can sell your archives to a repository. So just be aware of kind of the value of this material. So it's kind of like that thing of one man's garbage is another person's garbage is another person's gold. And that's the case with archives. Often the things that get tucked away that perhaps are seen as not having value are of incredible value to archives and to the research community that they serve. You'll also have an opportunity to negotiate research access to materials. So often repositories do prefer as few restrictions as possible, but we also understand that some materials, so you think of correspondence or diaries, this might be deeply personal and private material, and we respect that on occasion, this material might need to be restricted for a period. While material may be transferred physically to a repository, it's important to know that you as an artist would maintain the copyright and the intellectual ownership. So you and your executors or your heirs will continue to manage the copyright. So even though researchers will have access to the material, if they're going to use any of those materials, either in publishing or in any other use, they would still be required to consult you as the copyright owner. So these are just a few of the topics that you'll want to consider discussing within archives, and I'm sure there's other questions that might come up in the moment. But basically this process just involves a conversation between you and an archivist, and it can take place within a timeline that feels comfortable for you. You can ask as many questions as you want. We're really here to be a resource and to guide you to more information when we don't necessarily have the answers. So it's just your opportunity to play a role in starting the conversation and leading to a fruitful collaboration and transforming whose works are represented in archival repositories. So when we think about the silences, think about who should be represented in the archives and who's missing, and we can work together as a team to try and make sure that we're more representative in our collections.
Thanks, Heather. And Heather and I realized that we should conclude with a brief mention of how the archives in our care are used. And this is one example. In 2009, the University of Victoria Libraries published Untitled, the Artist's Archives. And it featured, as well as an introduction, 4 booklets, biographical booklets on the artists Margaret Peterson, Robin Hopper, Glenn Howarth, and Sandra Meeks. And this publication was accompanied by a collaborative exhibit we undertook with the University of Victoria Legacy Galleries in the space here in the library called the Maltwood Gallery. This was a particularly special initiative, and we are unfortunately unable to do this frequently and with all the archives in our care. Most of the time, our archives are used for teaching and research, both in our beautiful reading room, and the material can be accessed by the public, as well as students, faculty, and staff. And the materials are used in various ways for student assignments, for writing and creative projects, and of course by faculty for their teaching. We have 2 classrooms beside our reading room, and these classrooms are used for objects-based learning sessions. Sometimes a class may join us for the entire semester. Sometimes there are 1 or 2 special classes where students and the instructors come in, and materials are selected for that instructional session. Another example of what we do with archives can be found here. This is our brand new digital exhibit of the archives of Carl Spreitz, who I mentioned earlier. Carl Spreitz was a documentary filmmaker, artist, and frequent collaborator amongst his colleagues in the Liminal Society. So just 2 examples of special uses, and certainly these are invaluable collections for teaching and research. And with that, we thank you for your attention and we welcome your questions. And our email addresses are at the bottom of this slide, should you wish to get in touch with us.
Thanks so much. And we can drop our contact into the chat too.
Yeah.
So we'll stop our share so we can see everyone.
That was great. Thank you for the very thorough overview. We really do appreciate it, because I think so many of us, we have an idea, you know, like, oh, there's a building over on campus where there's a lot of cool stuff housed. But, you know, I think it was just like scratching the surface of what possibilities are there. Which leads me to my question. It was about research and how you work with either independent researchers and or academics on campus towards their research goals.
I'm just, Heather, I'll start. Depending on the researcher, they may have heard about us through these more public outreach activities like our publications or these talks, and they get in contact with Heather or I. Or you're very welcome to come into the reading room and just inquire at our information desk. We are a public archives and really a public library in the sense that anybody can use our holdings. So that may be how a research inquiry is initiated. Heather, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, as Lara mentioned, we're really here as a community and public resource, and we work with researchers locally, but we also try and connect researchers internationally with the collection so we can digitize material when requested. We work with classes, and this can include art history classes coming in, some of the usual suspects, but we also have visual arts come in with students who are learning about, like, how do you pursue creating art as a profession, and what does this look like? What do artist catalogs look like? For example, how do you share your work? So there's kind of quite a variety of researchers and emerging scholars who we support through our work. And also just seeing the archives as a generative place that you can continue to create and produce art from the contents of the collection. So we're just starting a new fellowship program next semester where we've invited students at UVic to imagine a creative or research topic that's in response to the holdings in the collection. And I'm really happy that we received submissions from students coming from visual arts who are interested in engaging with the collection. So archives are always, I think, seen as like dusty or this place that does preservation, but we don't preserve the materials for no reason. It's really for the people to be using, right? So making sure that that loop is close and that connection is made.
I wanted to mention that last night on the British Columbia broadcast, public broadcaster, the Knowledge Network, there was a documentary about the very famous abstract expressionist Rothko from the United States. And what that program underlined was the use of archives to tell his story, within the documentary and other works, but also to create other creative works. So there's a play called Red about Rothko, and clearly the playwright used Mark Rothko's archives to create some of the content. So that's an example of just a notable recent work. Obviously, Mark Rothko's archives are not here, but the creation of other significant creative works from archival sources.
I wonder if they talked or touched on in that documentary. I remember hearing an anecdote that his widow continued to compile a library of books that she thought he would have liked.
I had not heard that.
It's like this Fluxus idea that, you know, the history is always in the making or something like that. But yeah, because his library, I think, was part of you know, his archival holdings that were donated to wherever they ended up going to, or you know, acquired by. But yeah, she kept adding books. Like, oh yeah, Mark would have had this too, you know, or I'm sure he read that somewhere down the line.
Yeah, I mean, that's so fascinating because archives, I've heard of situations like that where like a partner will continue to kind of build the archives. I've heard of situations where people will send like clippings or like further information. So it's a really interesting thing of like the archives as a place of like memory and kind of like almost like memorial to people, like that you continue to kind of recognize and build someone's legacy. But that's really interesting, that one. It's very imaginative, very creative.
Yeah. There is a question in the chat from Olivier in Belgium, wondering about how could you ensure that if there is a flood, the archives are not impacted? And then I don't know, it's early for me still, but GDPR, I don't know what that is a shorthand for.
Right. The General Data Protection Regulation.
Oh, okay.
Is that? Yeah. I don't know, Olivier, if I've got that right, but that's.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, I could address the first question about flooding. I mean, we always hope that that we won't experience any of these sorts of emergencies, but we do have contingency plans in place for should our materials be affected by water damage. And this is something that we learn about in archive school, to have an emergency plan. So, you know, hope for the best, you know, expect the worst. So certainly with a lot of our archives, and we have archives in various media, should they be water damaged, we would have to undertake salvage, and that may include things such as freeze drying of materials. The key thing is to get to the materials as soon as you can. Unfortunately, Victoria is in an earthquake zone, so there's always the risk of a catastrophic earthquake. And in such a situation, salvage of the archives might not be possible for quite a long time. Fortunately, the University of Victoria is located on fairly high ground, so a lot of the flooding that you've been hearing about has not affected us here in British Columbia.
And I'm just like knocking on wood really hard right
now.
In the background here.
Yeah.
And then there's the question about like privacy and whether or not we've had to remove or destroy anything. That hasn't come up for us yet. But that's everything that BC, British Columbia in particular in Canada, has very strict privacy legislation. And there's a lot that we do locally as well. So researchers sign an agreement when they work with materials that if they do come across personal information, that there's restrictions on how that information is used. And then there are restrictions that can be put in place if there's material that's considered sensitive. But at this point, we haven't had any issues with material that's needed to be removed from the collection. I'm not sure, Lara, if you'd like to add anything to that.
I would just mention an example from the European context. We do have some, this is not Artist Archives, but transgender archives collection that did come to us from the UK from a researcher named Dr. Richard Eakins, who had a large collection in Ulster. And he chose to remove materials in that collection, which he had amassed as a faculty member, chose to remove and destroy research records of his because of the sensitive personal information they contained. So that material was removed before we received that gift. Yeah. And oftentimes, as Heather mentioned earlier, if there is sensitive personal information from a private person, an artist, a writer, what have you, we can have a discussion about the content of the archival fond to come and identifying just on our own in the discussion between institution and donor, whether some materials should not be included or whether they should have restrictions. Certainly we want restrictions to be limited and clearly defined. So it makes it easier for us to manage the collection. Yeah.
I just wanted to draw attention to an earlier question here in the chat from Alyssa. Alyssa is wondering about possibilities for public engagement with UVic archives. She said, there's obviously a huge public engagement possibility for the archives as UVic has some incredible holdings. Are there plans in future to engage broader communities even further?
Heather and I are both nodding. We're always looking for opportunities to engage with the community and engage with scholars. I mean, we are so excited. No, we're so excited about all our archives and we just want everybody to use them, but it is a large task. There's only a handful of us to do this work. So we welcome discussions with colleagues about ways to animate the archives, or as our university librarian, Jonathan Bankston says, surface the archives, surface the collections. Heather, anything to add there?
No, it's just a great question. Thank you, Alyssa, for asking it. And I think it's always questions around kind of the points where you do that. So like we work with the community to create archives or to build archives. And then we work with different researchers to make those archives accessible. But there's certainly more we could do in all of those areas. And we often are really, because we're at an educational institution, we often see archives as having this like educational role and really focus on connecting with like local, either like with Camosun or with students at the University of Victoria. Some of the arts colleges in town also come and bring classes. So that's where we put a lot of attention, but there's of course always more ways that we could do that work and adventures to go down with outreach. And I feel like there's some real exciting possibilities with making the archives accessible more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Sharon has a question about archival silences. Thank you, Sharon. And before we logged on, Heather and I were talking very quickly about correspondence. And correspondence can be, what exists with correspondence in artists' archives or writers' archives can be very tantalizing because often it's only the incoming correspondence that is preserved. I think you may, perhaps in some cases, a creative person may have the foresight to have, I don't know, carbon copies or some earlier draft versions, but those sort of, I would say, maybe not silences, but echoes of what may have been the full correspondence relationship are quite tantalizing. So some records may refer to other records which don't exist, which were not preserved. So, and sometimes materials are lost and sometimes materials are destroyed before they ever come to us. So that is potentially an interesting creative path to follow. So, speaking to the silences in the archives, what could they have been?
That's great. Well, I think, we're just about 5 minutes to noon, and it feels like a natural pause here. So thank you again so much, Lara and Heather. We really appreciate your time and what a thorough and lovely presentation.
Thank you.
So here at Creative Mornings, we've had the whole gamut of people just talking and talking and talking, and then people like really relying on slides, and then somewhere in between. And really the point is just sharing information and getting, you know, the conversation started and continued. So we really appreciate all the work you've done this morning to get that done. So thanks for that. And just as a reminder, the next, well, I guess not a reminder because we haven't really announced it yet, Leah, but the next Creative Mornings is going to be with Rick Waynes. If you can say a couple words about that and the date for our listeners here, our subscribers.
Yes. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this morning. So our next Creative Morning session is on the topic of invisible, and we're having a local playwright join us, Rick Waynes, and he is also someone who lives with HIV and will be speaking about certain plays that he's written and produced on the topic of living with HIV. And that also corresponds with our acknowledgement of December 1st as National HIV and AIDS Day. Yes, thank you once again for everybody for joining us, and I hope you have a safe and happy weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.